Welcome to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Carole J. Petersen. She is the director of the Matsunaga Peace Institute at the University of Hawaii. She also is a professor at the Richardson School of Law, University of Hawaii, Manoa. Our topic today is seeking peace and resolution. And what better of a guest could we have than the lady who heads up the Matsunaga Peace Institute. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, everybody's heard of Sparks Matsunaga since he was such a famous public servant who really served Hawaii very, very well. And his name is, the Institute is named after him. But I'm not sure a lot of our viewers know about the Peace Institute. So could you give us an introduction?
Sure. Well, the Matsunaga Institute for Peace is a small academic department. It's a unit that's based in the College of Social Sciences Public Policy Center. Mm-hmm. And I say we're an academic unit in the sense that we have an undergraduate Peace Studies program, and we also have a graduate certificate in conflict resolution. So we put on a number of courses, both in the regular schedule of courses for daytime students, but we also offer courses through Outreach College that any member of the community can take. So you don't have to be a full-time student at the University of Hawaii Manoa to take our courses. We have a number of graduate courses that professional people take, for example, advanced negotiation, mediation, facilitation of public meetings. We have a graduate course on family mediation as well, which is very popular. And then at the undergraduate level, we offer a BA in Interdisciplinary Studies, Peace and Conflict Resolution, and then we also offer an undergraduate certificate in peace, which is equivalent to a minor in Peace Studies.
Wow, you have several programs there, don't you?
Surprising, because we only have 4 faculty.
That was my next question. How many faculty members do you have?
Well, we really have 3.5 internal faculty. I say at half because I'm half paid by the William S. Richardson School of Law. Mm-hmm. So I only do half of my workload in the Matsunaga Institute. I teach a general course at the 400 level on human rights. Mm-hmm. So a course that non-law students can take if they want to learn about international human rights.
The 400 level would be upper division?
Yes, senior level, juniors and seniors, but in the BA, undergraduate, right. Okay. Whereas the rest of my teaching is in the law school. I teach gender and law and international law at the law school. And then we have 3 full-time faculty. We have Professor Brian Hallett, who oversees our undergraduate Peace Studies program. He's a political scientist. We have Professor Bruce Barnes, who is the graduate chair. He oversees the graduate certificate in conflict resolution. He's a professional mediator and a lawyer. And then we have Dr. Maya Sotoro Ng, who has recently moved over from the College of Education and joined the Matsunaga Institute. She's a specialist in peace education. And she teaches undergraduate courses on the history of peace movements and leadership for social change. And she also oversees our internship program, because we require all of our students who are majoring in or minoring in peace studies to do what we call a practicum and internship, where they are placed with an agency or a nonprofit organization, and they're doing public service work, but also learning about the positive aspects of making peace in the community and resolving conflicts.
So the faculty members are full-time faculty members, those 3.5.
And a half.
Okay.
And then, right, and then because we have need for more teachers, we also hire lecturers. When we
adjuncts?
have, yes, adjuncts, when we have the money. This has not been a good year for that. The budget's very tight, but we can offer additional courses through Outreach College where the student's tuition pays for the lecturer's fee. And then we also have a number of dedicated members of other departments who we call affiliate faculty, because their positions are in other departments, but we have cross-listed courses and they may serve as advisors. So we have people from the law school, for example, Professor John Barkey, who's an expert in ADR. His course counts toward our graduate certificate in conflict resolution. We have a number of people from political science. Dr. Carolyn Stevenson is one of our affiliate faculty in political science. We also have affiliate faculty from the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Dolores Foley, Kem Lowry, who's an emeritus. David Chandler is emeritus, a well-known mediator in the community who still helps with our family mediation class. Katie Bennett from the School of Social Work. There are lots of people who have their main positions elsewhere in the university, but they are all part of the Peace Studies and Conflict Resolution program. And that was kind of the original vision, is that it should be a multidisciplinary community of academics and students who have an interest in peace and conflict resolution.
What year did it start?
Oh, let's see, well before I got here. It was created, I should have brought my annual report. It was created in the 1980s, which was a time when there were a lot of new peace studies programs being created around the country. And originally, it was not named for Spark Matsunaga at first. It was named in his honor after he passed away. And I'm sorry to say I didn't have the honor.
It started when he was still alive,
yes.
but then renamed after his death.
Yes, that's correct. And at that time, many universities were starting peace studies programs. And then after he passed away, it was named in his honor. And it's kind of, part of our mission is to keep up the legacy of his work, because you may know he was instrumental in starting the U.S. Institute for Peace, which is based in Washington, D.C. And Spark Matsunaga really believed that the United States invests so much money in educating future military leaders, right? We put all this money into our academies, the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy. He thought we should also have an academy for peacemakers and diplomats. And the U.S. Institute for Peace has never been funded at that level, sadly, but it does some wonderful work. And so it's nice to honor his legacy by naming our own Peace Institute here after him.
Well, I want to ask you, specifically about the size of the budget, but where did the monies come from? Are they all generated through tuitions at the university, or does the institute receive outside grants and that sort of thing?
We have received some outside grants for specific programs. For example, the Graduate Certificate in Conflict Resolution was originally started with a grant from the Hewlett Foundation. And they helped to fund the beginnings of conflict resolution programs in many universities around the United States. But over time, what has happened is the positions have been institutionalized. So it's really like any other department in the university. We have a certain number of position numbers that were created by the legislature. So we have 3.5 position numbers, essentially. And then the other teaching and advising and program assistant comes from people who it's in their hearts that they want to support the program.
Okay, so many programs here. Let me make sure I got this straight here. Okay, the certificate program. Now,
the graduate or the undergraduate? We have two.
Okay, let's try undergraduate.
All right.
Okay, so that is something that a student would pursue in addition to their BA degree?
Their major, that's correct. So if a student might be majoring in political science or some other related topic, they might decide to get a minor in peace studies.
Okay.
And they would come to see Professor Brian Hallett, who oversees the undergraduate program, and he would explain the basic requirements are you must take at least the survey course, the 310 course, which is a survey of peace and conflict resolution, which is a very popular elective with students generally that Brian teaches. You must also take a skills course, either the basic mediation course, which is 447, or the basic negotiation course, which is 429, so that you develop the skills of a peacemaker. And then you must do your practicum and internship. And then you make up the additional credits in consultation with the undergraduate advisor, because there are a number of other courses, both within the Matsunaga Institute and from other departments, that will count toward the minor. So one of the electives would be my course, the Introduction to Human Rights, but someone might also take an elective in women's studies or in ethnic studies, because there are a number of courses that are relevant to peace studies.
The undergraduates that pursue the certificate at the Matsunaga Peace Institute, typically what area do they come from? What majors do they come from? Are there certain majors that tend to feed more into the Institute than others?
I would not say that there's any one major. I've seen people who have been majoring in political science. I've seen people who have been majoring in history, people who have been majoring in education, so business majors even. So I don't think there's any one major. Very often students take one course to dabble and then they find they're interested and they come back for more. And that's where I'm really happy that Brian has so successfully expanded the 310 course. It used to be a fairly small course, and he decided to just take a chance and increase it. The rule at UH Manoa is if it's a writing intensive course, it can only have 20 students because you have to make sure you give enough feedback to the students. And
that's a good rule.
It is a good rule, right? You can only write comments on so many papers every week. But at a certain stage, Brian decided, let's just try it and see what happens. He switched it from writing intensive to ethics focus. And you don't have a limit on the number of students. You have to meet certain requirements, and ethics is one of the requirements. And all of a sudden, his enrollment shot up to over 70, 80 students every semester. So there's clearly a strong interest in peace studies. And from that course, a number of students decide that they would like to minor. And a few even decide that they would like to major. We don't have a lot of majors at this stage.
Do you get many students that come in that are enrolled in Hawaiian studies programs?
I don't know. I would have to ask Brian about that because I don't do the undergraduate advising.
Okay, okay. And how about at the graduate level? Any folks that are pursuing Hawaiian studies at the graduate level?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. The graduate certificate in conflict resolution can be pursued as a solo qualification. You don't have to add it on to something. You can if you want. And many of our students are pursuing a PhD or an MA in political science or an MA in urban and regional planning. Some of them are pursuing master's degrees in education. Some are pursuing a JD in the law school. And those students want to obtain the graduate certificate in conflict resolution as an add-on qualification. But we also have some students who come just to do it as a standalone qualification. And it's, in terms of the credit levels, it's probably roughly equivalent to half of a master's.
Daniel Inouye, another famous public servant who served Hawaii so well for so long. The University of Hawaii has putting together a plan to build an institute in his honor. Is that going to be a cross-campus competition, or what's the focus of the Inouye Institute going to be?
I'm not involved in that initiative, so I couldn't tell you. I think from what I understand, the primary focus is on public service.
Okay.
But I don't see it as, competition.
Sort of a Kennedy School type approach?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I know that they're very interested in public service and public policy, but I honestly couldn't tell you more.
Okay.
Because I'm just not on that committee.
So there's
I have enough committees already.
Between two schools, you're busy enough.
Right.
Well, it doesn't sound like there'll be cross-campus competition there. That's good. Yeah. Wow, that's a really interesting program. And okay, now you mentioned the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. Are there other peace institutes across the country?
Sure. I mean, if you do a search on Google, you'll find lots of universities have peace institutes. Colgate University has one. I mean, lots of universities have them. I would say that increasingly, the peace institutes are beginning to expand their focus to include not only peace studies, but also conflict resolution, social justice, issues of human rights. And that is an interesting evolution in peace studies, because I think there was a time when people really thought of peace studies as simply the absence of violence, prevention of violence. But increasingly in the literature and in our scholarship and in our social activism, we look at not just the absence of violence, but also things like structural violence, which would include inequality. So you might have a community that doesn't have overt violence, but actually has a lot of structural violence if there's a lot of poverty, inequality, suppression of human rights. And so increasingly, peace studies programs do include the study of social justice and human rights, as well as just peace. And so some of the institutes and programs around the country have sort of expanded the title, if you will, to include other related disciplines. And sometimes you'll find peace studies programs inside of law schools or inside colleges of social sciences. That sometimes they're independent. They might be an independent unit in the university. So there's a variety of approaches.
It's an interesting point that you make. There seems to be a growing demand for, the ability to acquire skills in negotiation and conflict resolution.
Absolutely. I mean, in my specialty, which is human rights law, there's a whole subspecialty on how do you resolve complaints of human rights violations. And we lawyers, we tend to say, let's go to court, let's get a judgment. But there's a lot of research to suggest that sometimes you're better off negotiating a remedy, because especially if you're in a situation where you're going to have to work with the other party on a long-standing basis, you don't necessarily just want to have a winner-take-all solution, that you might want to have a mediated outcome that allows both sides to continue to work together. And that's very important in some situations such as disability rights. If a child's right to an education has been denied on the basis of that child's disability, which is an area that I do some work on, you could go to court and get a judgment, but then that child may have an antagonistic relationship with the school. So you might prefer to have a mediated outcome. And that's one of the areas that I know my colleague Bruce Barnes does some work on, which is helping to facilitate and mediate complaints from parents against schools or school systems when their child's right has been denied. So that's a whole specialty area of both of conflict resolution and also of human rights.
Interesting. You're watching Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Carole J. Petersen, the director of the Matsunaga Peace Institute and also professor at the Richardson School of Law, University of Hawaii, Manoa. Our show today is Seeking Peace and Resolution. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ, and my local interest is in sports. I have my own sports radio show at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com. We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
Hi, my name is Seymour Kazimirski. I have a show called Seymour's World on ThinkTech Hawaii. Our show is about opening minds and facilitating conversations. To tell you the truth, I have no idea what we're going to be talking about. I have no idea who our guests are going to be, but I guarantee you we're going to have lots and lots of fun. Aloha from Seymour's World.
Welcome to ThinkTech, Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Carole J. Petersen. She is the director of the Matsunaga Peace Institute at the University of Hawaii and also professor of law at the Richardson School of Law, University of Hawaii, Manoa. We've been talking about the Peace Institute. We're going to move on now to an area in which Carole specializes, and that's human rights, and an area in which she also has a number of publications. How did you get interested in human rights?
I got interested in human rights when I was still in law school. I did not think it would ever be my career. My first job out of law school was as a corporate litigator in New York, but I volunteered for a group called Lawyers for Human Rights in New York City. And my very first matter that I helped with was a political asylum case by someone who had come to the U.S. and claimed political asylum. And I remember the supervising lawyer who gave me the case said, "You're never going to win, but just try to delay," because this man's son was in the United States and was in fact, had been given a green card and was actually in the U.S. military, and therefore when he became 21, you could sponsor his father for permanent residence. So he said, just make sure you don't let this guy get deported. But in fact, we did win. We won his appeal, and he got political asylum. So that gave me kind of the...
This was a nonprofit that you're working for?
Yeah, I was working for Simpson, Thacher and Bartlett, a major New York law firm, but I was doing pro bono work for a group called Lawyers Committee for Human Rights in New York. And virtually every law firm in New York City wants their lawyers to do a little bit of pro bono. I mean, that's basically a requirement that everybody do some pro bono work. And I just found it a lot more interesting than commercial litigation, I have to say. But I didn't really contemplate focusing on it until I became a teacher. And I moved out to Hawaii initially in 1988 to join my then boyfriend, now husband, Charlie Booth. And then we moved.
Also a faculty member?
Yes, also a
law
faculty
school?
member at the law school. And I practiced here for a year. I was a young associate at Kate Shetty for 1 year. But then we got the offers to go to Hong Kong and to start teaching. And when I was, of course, every new law professor, your job is to find a research program. And I had been doing a lot of litigation in New York at that time on computer software and copyright issues. And so I brought my little box of materials to Hong Kong thinking that I would do research on that. And when I got to Hong Kong, I joined a women's organization, found out about sex discrimination in Hong Kong. And then, of course, Hong Kong was it was right after the Tiananmen Square massacre. So Hong Kong was in a bit of a state. The government was proposing a Bill of Rights ordinance to reassure the public. And so that box of computer software materials eventually got thrown away. I never did any research on that. I wound up researching human rights law, and especially the right to equality, but also issues of academic freedom and civil liberties, and that became my area of specialty. And when I was in Hong Kong, we created a new LLM, a Master's in Law program in human rights. So the University of Hong Kong has still an LLM in human rights, and I believe it was the first LLM in human rights in East Asia, and it's really thriving now. So I had the pleasure of teaching master's level courses in that program, and it was wonderful because, you know, here we have one course in international human rights, and we have some specialty courses, say my gender and law class. But at the University of Hong Kong, because there was a whole master's in the program, there were 8 different courses on human rights. We had one in civil and political rights, one on the right to equality, one on children's rights. So it was really a wonderful place to teach and do research.
Do you do any commercial litigation these days?
No.
I mean, it sounds like you've got
gave that
plenty
up.
right here with all these different aspects of human rights, be it gender inequality or women's rights or whatever. You mentioned, excuse me, you mentioned Hong Kong, and of course we know that you lived there for 17 years. You taught law. You also attended, what was it, the postgraduate course in Chinese law, was it at Hong Kong University?
I did study Chinese law for a period of just 1 year, sort of like a half of an LLM program. And that was because I knew, I mean, everybody knew that in 1997, Hong Kong was going to become part of China, and I had not studied Chinese law as a law student, so I wanted to have a better grasp of mainland Chinese law.
Well, tell us about women's issues in Hong Kong.
Absolutely. It was very interesting because when I moved to Hong Kong in 1989, there was no law prohibiting sex discrimination in Hong Kong. And you could open the newspaper and you would see advertisements that specified male engineer, female secretary. I mean, there was no law that prohibited from advertising for gender-specific candidates. Also age discrimination. They would say under 35 or under 30 for the secretary. So I joined this organization called the Hong Kong Council of Women and another organization, the Business and Professional Women's Association of Hong Kong, and we were actively lobbying the Hong Kong government to enact a law prohibiting sex discrimination. And as a result of my activities with those organizations, I was also asked by a legislator in Hong Kong. Her name was Anna Wu. She's now a member of the Executive Council in Hong Kong, but at that time she was a member of the Legislative Council, and her goal was to introduce the first anti-discrimination law in Hong Kong. So I was very lucky. She asked another professor, Andrew Burns, and myself to help her draft the bill. So I got the experience of drafting legislation and also doing public consultation with organizations about the content of the bill. We drafted the bill very broadly. We actually wanted to base it on Australian law, which prohibited discrimination on the grounds of gender, race, age, sexuality, religion, political belief, you name it, we had it in there. In the end, we didn't get all of that through, but the government finally compromised.
What year was this again now?
This was, we introduced the bill in 1994. And a compromise package of legislation was enacted in the summer of 1985. We got
So Chris Patton was governor at this time?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. And we got through the sex discrimination ordinance and the disability discrimination ordinance, which were the first two pieces of legislation prohibiting discrimination to be enacted in Hong Kong. And that also led to the creation of the Equal Opportunities Commission in Hong Kong, which provides free assistance to people who have complaints of discrimination. And now the jurisdiction of the EOC has expanded in Hong Kong to also include race discrimination. So it's been a real pleasure to watch that body of law expand in Hong Kong and to watch people use the law. It was pretty blatant. Before these laws were enacted, women would be dismissed when they got pregnant. You know, just like, no, we're not going to pay maternity leave here, you're dismissed. Or you've reached 35, you're dismissed. You got married, we don't want people who are married, you're dismissed. I mean, it was really very blatant because there was no law prohibiting it. So that was one of the things that came about in Hong Kong during that transition period, which was really positive in my opinion.
In this respect, did Hong Kong become sort of a model for other Asian societies?
Well, I think that Hong Kong law can serve as a model for a number of other places in Asia. I have often given lectures at conferences, sometimes training conferences in mainland China. I also, just last fall, I lectured in a gender training conference in East Timor. And I always bring out the Hong Kong legislation and the Hong Kong model. Partly because I think it's useful for people who are thinking about legislating to have a model that's in their own neighborhood. I mean, sometimes people will say, oh, that's just a Western concept, right? Anti-discrimination law, we don't need it here. But when I show them that it was fought for by Hong Kong women's organizations and other civic organizations in Hong Kong, and that it's been working now since 1995, then they show more of an interest.
That's really pretty interesting, because this is a very young country which has all kinds of struggles. I mean, just basic existence.
Absolutely, yeah. The peacekeeping troops only left in 2012.
And they're interested in gender law.
They are, and
Quite
it's
interesting.
Partly because one of the treaties that Timor-Leste ratified when they joined the United Nations was the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is a mouthful. We abbreviate it CEDAW. And the CEDAW Treaty obligates governments to prohibit gender discrimination. And East Timor has a way to go before they accomplish that, but they have taken the initiative. And they are getting some assistance from an agency known as UN Women. It's the major agency in the United Nations that promotes gender equality. And that agency partnered with a group that I do work with, the Asia Pacific branch of the International Women's Rights Action Watch in Malaysia. And so they go around Asia and train not only women's groups, but also government officials and judges about the concept of gender equality and what it takes to try to promote women's rights. And so they invited me in October to go and give some lectures on CEDAW, the CEDAW Treaty, and how to implement this kind of legislation.
So, I'm sorry, who invited you? It was
IRA Asia Pacific and UN Women.
Oh, I see. Okay, great. Oh, that sounds pretty interesting. How long were you there?
I was there for just, I'd say about 10 days. Yeah, I delivered 2 trainings, one for their National Human Rights Commission and one for the executive branch. And although it was only 2, I think 3-day trainings, by the time you fly in and out, I was gone for close to 10 days because it's difficult to get in and out of Timor-Leste.
It's pretty remote, yeah.
Yeah. The flights from Singapore were sort of 2 or 3 times a week. So. But it was a very interesting country, and I have to really admire the people there for how hard they're working to rebuild their nation. I mean, they lost probably close to 1/3 of their population during the war with Indonesia. It was really tough.
Timor-Leste is a Portuguese colony for 400 plus years, and the Portuguese seem to have done absolutely nothing there to have developed it, from what I can tell.
That's right. That's right.
It's really very, very underdeveloped.
Yes.
Now, it seems to me that, one of the always a big issue in Hong Kong is the treatment of domestic help, especially Filipino maids. And then that's certainly an area that comes right up on women's rights and gender discrimination and that sort of thing. And I suppose you did some work in that area as well.
I did, yes. I did do a study of migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong. We interviewed about 23 women who were working under such bad conditions that they'd actually fled their employers. And so we interviewed them in a shelter. There's a shelter for domestic workers in Hong Kong. The interesting thing that we found is that the legal framework in Hong Kong in general is pretty good. There's a standard form contract that everyone has to enter into. It has a minimum wage, required days of rest. It even sets out the size of the room that you must provide for your live-in migrant domestic worker, and the food allowance and everything. But there are a lot of violations, and some of the violations start right with the recruitment process, because some of these women are not hired directly by the employer. They are recruited by employment agencies that go to their home countries, usually the Philippines or Indonesia. And they are often put into situations of debt bondage. And although this is illegal under Hong Kong law, sometimes the Hong Kong government either doesn't know about it, or perhaps they turn a blind eye to it because it happens in the home country.
Right.
And so they might be recruited, say in Indonesia, and brought to something that the recruitment agency calls a training facility. And there they're sort of taught to iron shirts and make Cantonese meals. And then they're told to sign something, and the next thing they know, they're in debt for 5 to 7 months of salary, right? And the way it is structured, we discovered, is that the women would be brought to Hong Kong, and before they're brought to their employer, they were brought to a lending agency, right? Money lender agency. And then the money lender would give a big fee to the employment agency. And then the women would be made to sign something saying that they owed money to the money lender, right? And then when they were brought to their employer, the employer was said, this woman is in debt. She's been given an advance. Of course, she hadn't been given an advance at all. The employment agency had. And she is in debt, therefore you should pay her salary to this account for the first, say, 5 months, right? Now that is actually illegal under Hong Kong law. To give the salary to anyone other than the employee is prohibited. But a lot of employers do it, sometimes because they're given discounts by the employment agency, or maybe they don't understand. And so women wind up being in a situation where they're getting either very little or perhaps no salary for several months. And what prevents them often from making complaints is something called the 2-week rule in Hong Kong. And this 2-week rule says that your visa only runs for the 2-year contract, the employment contract, or 2 weeks after you terminate the contract. So if a woman is fired or she walks away from her employer because she's not being paid, under Hong Kong immigration law, she has 2 weeks to leave. Now, if she files a complaint with the Labor Department, which she can do, the Labor Department will write her a note. She can take it to the Immigration Department. The Immigration Department will extend her visa, but she's not allowed to work. So now she's living on charity, and she's waiting to try to prosecute her claim. It can be a very long, painstaking process. So the recommendation that we made in the study that we published back in 2005 is you've got to get rid of the 2-week rule. That's one thing you have to do. And I also think they have to find a way to cut out the employment agencies. I recommended that the Hong Kong government set up its own public authority to do the recruitment. I think the reason the Hong Kong government doesn't want to do that is that there is tension in Hong Kong over the whole question of importing labor, as there often is. And there are some women in Hong Kong who feel that they could have these jobs, right, if the migrant domestic workers weren't coming in. I mean, a lot of women wouldn't necessarily want to be live-in domestic workers, but they might want to work from 9 to 5, and they feel they're not getting those opportunities. So I think the Hong Kong government is caught a little bit in the middle. They don't want to be seen as encouraging the importation of labor by being the recruiter. They also don't want to prohibit it, though, because there are probably easily 300,000 families in Hong Kong that depend very heavily on migrant domestic workers for childcare. So it's a delicate issue in Hong Kong.
Well, we're going to take another break here. This is Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Carole J. Petersen from the Matsunaga Peace Institute and also the Richardson School of Law. We have been talking about seeking peace and resolution, and we'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. That's Ted Ralston. You know, Ted is the host of Where the Road Leads. It shows every Friday from 4 to 5 p.m. It's about technology. It's about how people collaborating and solve problems with modern technology. It's where the road leads. We all know that. We should all be listening. Join us there, 4 to 5 p.m. every Friday. Now, what about that do you agree with?
All of it.
I knew he'd say that. Aloha. Say aloha.
Aloha.
Good.
Aloha, Yappers. This is your host, Kingsley, for the Yap Show. Every Friday, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. You can catch us here live, ThinkTech Hawaii, and then later on we upload to our YouTube channel. We talk about youth issues, policies, youth programs, and how to transition yourself into adulthood.
But this was like a sign, I guess. Hey, life's like, hey,
Right.
now's your chance to go back to school, which I'm doing.
Catch us here again live, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. Aloha.
Aloha, my name is Josh Green. I host a show called Healthcare in Hawaii here on ThinkTech. We get together once a week or sometimes twice a month. Depends. When we're busy, we get together less often, but we love to see you here to talk about the preeminent healthcare issues in our state. Our programs vary very widely. We talk about economics, we talk about healthcare, we talk about social issues on this program. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome back to Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Carole J. Petersen. We've been talking about the Matsunaga Peace Institute, also human rights issues, especially with a Hong Kong focus. And now we want to talk just very briefly about Chinese law. Just very generally, what's your view on Chinese law?
Well, that's a big question. I would say that...
Unfair question?
Yeah, it's just a big question. I think Chinese law on paper has improved dramatically in the past few decades. Certainly in the human rights field, they've enacted some laws that represent improvement, but the problem is enforcement. There is no independent judiciary in China, so you can't enforce the law against the government. And even in some situations where non-governmental organizations have successfully enforced laws against private companies, say employment discrimination laws, which they do have in China now, sometimes they find that they suffer some retaliation afterwards. So there's a real problem with just basic rule of law still in China. I mean, rule of law isn't just what's written on paper, it's how it's implemented and enforced. And there's a real absence of that still in China. I don't know whether the Chinese government will ever be prepared to have a truly independent judiciary, because in order to have an independent judiciary, you have to be prepared for the possibility that that judiciary may rule against you someday. And I don't see the Chinese Communist Party being open to that anytime soon.
Exactly, it undercuts the power of the party.
Of course.
Umbrella movement. Now, it seems to me that you knew at least one of the key leaders of the movement, Benny Tai.
I used to teach with him in the University of Hong Kong.
Tell us a little bit about him, and then let's talk about the movement in general.
Benny Tai is very committed to democracy, very committed to human rights, wonderful teacher. I think he may have been a little bit naive when he started the Occupy Central movement. For those of you who don't know, Occupy Central and the Umbrella Movement are names for two movements in Hong Kong that are both devoted to trying to make Hong Kong more democratic. Hong Kong is a special administrative region of China. It is supposed to have a high degree of autonomy, and to some extent it has worked. Hong Kong still has an independent judiciary, an independent legal profession, academic freedom, civil liberties, religious freedom. All of those things still exist in Hong Kong, in my opinion. I'm not saying there haven't been threats along the way. There have been some threats and controversies, but in general, Hong Kong has done a better job than I expected of preserving civil liberties since it reunited with mainland China in 1997. Democracy has been the big disappointment because the Hong Kong people were promised, both under the Joint Declaration, the treaty with Great Britain, and also under the Basic Law, which is Hong Kong's sort of regional constitution, that they were going to move toward democracy, toward a fully elected legislature, and also toward eventually electing the chief executive, who sort of replaced the governor of Hong Kong, the old British governor. And that has not happened. So Article 45 of the Basic Law says that the ultimate aim is that the chief executive will be elected through universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee.
Let me just jump in here a second here. This term, universal suffrage, is really a bone of contention, isn't it? I mean, because there's some people that interpret it one way, there's some that interpret it another way. In my Western mindset, universal suffrage means everybody gets to vote for their political leaders. and there's free nomination.
Right.
China's view of universal suffrage is somewhat different.
Well, of course, and that's why they put those words into Article 45 of the Basic Law. It says universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. You can have a long discussion about what that means. Benny Tai was part of a group of scholars and activists who really wanted what they referred to as civic nomination, the right to simply nominate anyone. So, like you say, you'd have free choice. And China was absolutely against that, and also argued that that would make the term nominating committee, meaningless. And China has a point there. I mean, it is in the Basic Law. We may not like it, but it is there. So when I went to Hong Kong last March, we had a conference there on different proposals for nomination systems. And Benny was at that conference, and he was suggesting the civic nomination route. Some other people were as well. I was arguing for something that would be a little bit more conservative than that, because I didn't think China would ever accept civic nomination. And so I was trying to argue for ways to create a nominating committee that would be representative. I mean, for example...
Just not the tycoons.
Yes, not just the tycoons, right. So, for example, if the nominating committee consisted of all members of the Legislative Council, right, I think that would be acceptable to a lot of people in Hong Kong, even though not all of the Legislative Council is elected from geographic constituencies. Some are elected from these funky functional constituencies, so it's not a purely democratic institution, but it's democratic enough, I think, in a lot of people's minds. Other people suggested other ways of creating a nominating committee that would be more representative, at least than this 1,200-member selection committee that currently operates.
Isn't it fair to say, though, that Hong Kong, despite its shortcomings, democratic shortcomings at the present time, is more democratic than it was under British control?
Yes, that is true.
Because I think sometimes that's overlooked.
That's lost. That's right. Under the pure British colonial model, the governor was appointed by London, and he sailed in his big colonial hat.
Living in his colonial mansion?
Until Chris Patton, who was a little more political. But before that, they were really colonial officials.
Right.
And the Legislative Council was 100% appointed.
Right.
And it was a part-time legislature. On Wednesday afternoons at 2:30, they'd come over from their banks or wherever else they did their job, and for half a day on Wednesday, they would stamp their approval on whatever the governor proposed, right? It changed after 1984 when the Joint Declaration was signed, and at 85 when it was ratified. It was that time when the British colonial government began to create a sense more of self-government in Hong Kong, because they realized they couldn't just hand that model over, because instead of being a colony of London, you'd suddenly be a colony of Beijing, which is a lot worse, because at least London is answerable to an elected government there, right? Parliament is elected. So to hand over Hong Kong in that manner would have been unthinkable. And that is why the Joint Declaration allowed for these democratic reforms. So they introduced the first directly elected seats to the Legislative Council in 1991. And that really opened the space for some of the reforms that I told you about earlier. I mean, believe me, the colonial legislature never would have enacted a sex discrimination ordinance, right? But it was because the Legislative Council became more accountable to the public that this kind of law reform, the Bill of Rights, the sex discrimination ordinance, the disability discrimination ordinance, that legislation became possible under a more reformed Hong Kong. So you're absolutely right, Hong Kong is more democratic now than it was. But the people were really promised something more than they've gotten. And to be honest, if you had let the Hong Kong people decide in 1984, they would have preferred to stay a British colony than to go back to China. Every public opinion poll showed that. So they didn't get what they wanted. They were kind of told, you are going back to China, and in exchange for that, they were made certain promises, which I think need to be kept.
We have about 1 minute left here.
Oh, dear.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point, because you say that most people would have preferred to remain a British Crown colony rather than be part of China, and I think
because they don't trust the Communist Party.
It's important to remember that a lot of people in Hong Kong, escaped the oncoming communist armies in Shanghai.
Many are refugees or the children or grandchildren of refugees from China,
including the tycoons, who now seem to be extremely friendly with the mainland, which always seems to be a bit of a contradiction to me, but. I'm not a businessman, so I guess I don't understand that. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank
So
you.
it gave us a lot to think about. We are, know a lot more about the Matsunaga Peace Institute than we did about 45 minutes ago.
Well, and if you would like to know more, please log on to our website. As I said, we offer many courses that are open to the general public, and we have a really interesting course in Hiroshima this summer called Hiroshima and Peace, if anyone's interested.
Great. And thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.